Good evening and welcome to the RSP Film and Data Podcast. This is episode 8. We are in championship weekend, so hopefully many of you that are listening to us, you're trying to bring home that fantasy football championship trophy. Jay is here with me as usual. We've got a special edition for you guys. This is a holiday edition, so we decided that we would, we would designate this episode as the Island of Misfit Toys. So surely you guys have seen that, but we're going to talk about some players here in a few minutes that are guys that, really had been castaways. They had been thrown to the side, but now all of a sudden they're relevant, and they very well may be guys you're considering having in your fantasy football lineup this weekend for championship weekend. But before we get into that, let's say hi to Jay. Jay, how you doing tonight, man?
Good, Dwayne. I think you might be overestimating the old school popular culture knowledge that goes with the Island of Misfit Toys. That movie was made in the 50s, I think.
And yeah, but they still play it. They still play it on TV. Of course, nobody watches TV now. All the young folks. It's more about social media and things like that than actual TV, I guess.
Look, man, I grew up watching the classic Rudolph. The puppets, the Abominable Snowman, the Island of Misfit Toys. But I think probably these 20-year-olds listening to this podcast have no idea what we're talking about.
You guys need to hit us up on Twitter. Hit Jay and I up on Twitter after this show. Just let us know. Yes, you know who we're talking about, or no, you don't. I don't know. I have a feeling still a lot of people know, just because if for anything else, just the memes. So I think the memes bring attention to what it is. But how are you, Jay? Anything else? I know you were doing really well in Scott Fishbowl for a while. I haven't checked on your team though to see how it's looking right now, or any other championship games you got coming this weekend.
Yeah, man, my Scott Fishbowl team bowed out. I got a first round bye. Actually won my division, but the first round of the playoffs where my team was active, the two biggest studs on my team were McCaffrey and Chris Godwin. Didn't quite put up the numbers that we were used to seeing through the season. Actually scored my fewest points of the year in that, I guess it was the second round of the Scott Fishbowl playoffs. So ended up not making it through. And actually was in a couple semifinals last week, both with teams with Patrick Mahomes, and, didn't have the greatest game there. So I actually lost both of those in close battles. So I'm done, man. I'm out. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I have several that have bowed out. I've got a few still going this weekend for championship weekend, and in fact, on one of those teams, I was just talking to a buddy of mine earlier. We've been in a dynasty league forever together, and he has Mike Evans, and so last weekend I went ahead and picked up Perriman and Justin Watson, just knowing that he had Mike Evans and that we may both advance to play in the championship game this weekend. And I originally just picked him up to be a blocker, and now as we sit here tonight, I've got him active in my lineup. So maybe that's where we should start. Breshad Perriman, receiver for the Tampa Bay Bucks, 2015 first round draft pick, pick 26 by the Ravens out of Central Florida. Over the last 3 weeks, 14, 16, and 35 points if you're in a full point PPR. Week 15, hauled in 5 balls for 113 yards, 3 touchdowns against the Lions. Jameis was dealing pretty much all game long. Perriman was the guy doing the damage, especially with the touchdowns, averaging 22.6 yards, per reception. And if you just look at, the way that the team's utilizing him, really, and this is where I'll be curious to get your thoughts, Jay, watching the film, but when you look at the data, they seem to be using him in a way where Perriman's almost like he's perfect for this offense, because Arians loves to push the ball down the field. Jameis Winston likes to push the ball down the field. Perriman brings a vertical element. That's really kind of the niche he's settled into at this point in his career, and you'll be able to elaborate more on if you're seeing, things beyond that. But if you look at him the last, few weeks, really the role he's taken over is Mike Evans. He's the guy that's working deep. His average depth of target in these last 2 weeks, 16 yards and 21 yards on the seasons. He's at 17.1 yards per target. That's his average depth of target. Mike Evans was at a 15.7 before he got hurt. So Perriman looks to be the guy that they're using to push that ball vertically down the field, and we saw a flash of this last year at the end of the year with Cleveland. And Cleveland originally had re-signed Perriman in the offseason. I don't know if you remember that. They had signed him to a one-year deal, but then when they brought in Odell Beckham Jr., they both agreed to dissolve the contract, and that opened him up to go join Tampa Bay and become the third guy in that trio, whenever they go to 11 personnel, along with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. But so right now, Perriman's a guy, like I said, that if you're in the fantasy playoffs, you may be considering, having him in your lineup, especially if you lost Mike Evans, you lost Chris Godwin, lots of injuries going around at this time of year. Jay, what are you seeing when you turn the film on, with this former first round pick, who has really been a misfit toy up until this point?
Yeah, I think, with Breshad Perriman, everything starts with his speed. One of the biggest size speed freaks actually in the past, decade or so at receiver, which is why he was a first round pick. Tracks the ball pretty well on those deep passes. But one issue he's had throughout his career has been inconsistent hands technique. Our colleague, our inspiration over at the RSP, Matt Waldman, something he harps on pretty frequently is just how receivers approach catching the ball. There are certain techniques that result in, just a higher frequency of making catches based on the angle the ball's coming at you. And so when you watch Perriman, you'll often see him catch balls in ways where you're like, well, that was sort of odd, It's an over the shoulder catch. Typically you have your hands, your pinky sort of together, making that, basket catch, type of posture. He'll do something where he reaches his inside arm over the top and sort of backhand catches it on those deep passes. And so just with things like that, there's the chance for drop passes, and he's a guy that's had issues with drops through his career. The key here, though, is the offense really that he's in, and you already alluded to this in your build-up with Perriman. Bruce Arians really has the perfect system for a guy like Perriman, because Arians' system, really what it does and what it's been successful at doing, even when he was back working with Peyton Manning in Indianapolis, is scheming guys open on downfield routes. A lot of coaches, a lot of coordinators can scheme guys open in the short passing game, but defenses really try to take away those intermediate and deep balls, obviously, given the potential impact on the game of completing deep ball after deep ball. But you watched this game last week against Detroit, and Detroit's had issues in their secondary this year against a lot of teams. But, really, Arians is just scheming things up. And Perriman's getting open, not necessarily because he's, running excellent routes, beating man-to-man coverage, but just based on the play design. And so I actually posted a little mini thread on this on Twitter earlier today. The first quarter, Bruce Arians calls a levels concept where basically, you have a receiver running a post and a receiver running a shallow crosser underneath. You're picking on one particular defender. If he sticks with the shallow guy, you go deep. And so it's open. Perriman's open on the post, but Winston is going through his progression on the other side. Cameron Braid is open, and he hits him for, an 8-yard gain or so. Few plays later, Arians and the offensive staff, having seen Perriman get open, call the exact same play, for Perriman out of a different formation, a little bit different setup, but he's wide open for his first touchdown, which is that deep post over the middle, because the safety who's in the middle of the field in a quarters coverage, comes up to cover the shallow crossing route. And then, you look at his other touchdowns, and he's being schemed free releases, which is key for Perriman because he's really unrefined with his releases against press coverage. He sort of just tries to run and wave his hands, and he either gets jammed up or he'll get lucky and sort of escape with his speed. And then also his routes aren't necessarily that refined either. So really the key is for him, being able to capitalize on that scheme, have other developments in the play, get him open. And Bruce Arians, is probably the best coach in the NFL, I would say, at getting those types of, deep posts, deep in routes schemed open.
So if you're, thinking about a guy like Perriman, well, first, actually, before I jump into the fantasy ramifications, I just jotted down a question for you. So, and we've talked about this a little bit before, but you're right. The inconsistent hands thing is something that Matt, continually talks about the techniques. It seems like that would be something that would be coachable. why does that continue to be a problem for somebody that was drafted in 2015? Why can he not learn to basket catch a ball, if it's over his shoulders? I mean, that is just strange to me. But I mean, you've coached and you've been around, I'm sure kids that figured it out, maybe ones that didn't. Any thoughts on that?
It's a really complex question. Why can some people improve and get better at certain things, and some people tend not to show growth in certain areas? And, there's so many things that go into it. There's the cognitive aspect, there's the athletic component, the, neuromuscular connections that go into coordination to catching a basket catch. You could imagine that if someone had been catching a ball like that since they were a child, they'd feel pretty comfortable with it. Whereas someone who, may have started catching a football later or typically played catch, facing someone throwing them the ball may have more trouble with the basket catch. I'm sure that he's been coached on it, and probably in practice, I'm guessing that he, is able to execute these catches. But when you get in the games and everything increases in speed, you have less time to think, and it's more of just, that muscle memory relying on what your body's been doing for a long time. Those old habits are really hard to break, when it comes to that fine, detailed execution. So, that would be my explanation. I'm not sure why some people are able to make the adjustment and not. And, it's probably one of the holy grails of coaching is figuring out a way to get through with those fine, complex movements, in live game action to a majority of your players.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. That just seems like one that, it's not like this immediate, reaction. You're going deep. You've been trained how to catch the ball. It's really a natural way to be catching the ball. Like, it'd be one thing if, like, hey, on stop route or comeback routes that are timing routes, his hand-eye coordination isn't quick enough, to like get his hands in the right spot and he's fighting the ball off. Like, that's kind of like that feels super like, that would be tied to neurological response time, things like that. But some things like this, it's just like the basket catching. It's strange to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm underestimating it. I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a relatively simple thing. I agree with you. And so I don't know exactly. I don't know that I have a great answer as to why some players struggle with handset. Cortland Sutton is someone that Matt focuses on all the time. You frequently see him with his hands separated and, clapping down on the ball, which is just not a natural way to catch a football. And Sutton, for the most part, has made it work, especially this year.
Yeah, Michael Gallup does it too.
It's like, why can't you get your hands together and just really, gently support the ball as it comes in? Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely see that with Michael Gallup. He catches balls in weird ways and he turns them into these really tough catches that he almost doesn't secure as he comes down. He's progressed in a lot of ways, but I still see some of that from him too. Well, from a fantasy aspect, we've got the Bucks playing at home this weekend versus, the Texans. The Texans are a plus matchup for receivers. So if we've got owners that are listening and maybe they lost Mike Evans, maybe they lost, Chris Godwin, how comfortable would you now? Folks need to watch the weather, in this game, because if the winds get up in the 20-mile-an-hour range, that really messes up the deep passing game. 15 miles an hour does have an effect. It can have an effect, but Jameis is used to playing with some wind and some elements in that stadium. It's one of the stadiums that, they deal with wind a little bit more than others. So he's adapted to that some, but if it's really high winds, folks just need to watch that. But assuming that, the weather holds up and, it's conditions that are okay to play in, how comfortable would you be with plugging a guy like Perriman in, to your lineup, knowing that, you don't have Godwin, you don't have Evans? I mean, to me, it's got to be him and Evans and, O.J. Howard, Brait, and then I don't know a lot about Justin Watson, but if you have anything you want to say about any of those guys in your answer, feel free.
Well, here's the thing about a guy like Perriman, where, as I alluded to in his production against Detroit, where he had, a giant game, really explosive game, 3 touchdowns, over 100 yards. They're playing against Detroit, a defense that has had issues throughout the season with communication, with scheme breakdowns, free runners going down the field for deep passes. And Houston is another one of the teams in the NFL that has had issues with that all year. When you look at objective rankings in terms of defensive, Football Outsiders DVOA, you have Detroit as the 4th worst pass defense. Houston is the 7th worst pass defense by that metric. And when you watch them, it's a lot of those same issues, like I said, where the safeties, aren't communicating or aren't quite picking up their responsibility. Drew Lock picked them apart a few weeks ago, really just with a lot of coverage breakdowns where you're sort of wondering, what the safety is doing with his head in the clouds. And when you have a master schemer like Arians against a defense that has had issues with coverage breakdowns, and a receiver who sort of capitalizes on those breakdowns rather than, creating his own opportunities, that's where you have the recipe for a potential big game for Perriman. So because the defensive matchup is Houston and not New England or San Francisco, where you really need a receiver to win individually, I'd feel comfortable rolling him out there. And, there's a chance that he has another explosive game.
Yeah, so think of it, would you rather play, let's just to kind of give folks, maybe an idea of where we would be ranking this. Would you rather play Breshad Perriman versus Houston, or would you rather play Jarvis Landry versus the Ravens?
I think I'd roll the dice on Perriman because he has a potential of, like I said, an explosive game that could really turn the outcome. And when you're in that championship week, it's going all or nothing there. Yeah. Is there a chance that he lays an egg? It's probably a little bit higher than Landry. Landry probably has a higher floor, but I think Perriman definitely has the higher ceiling and probably the higher median if I had to really choose one.
I agree. So I think, to kind of try and make that actionable for folks, if you truly are facing a decision like this weekend, if you think you're a dog in the game, in the championship game, maybe you came up against the team, for example, that owns Lamar Jackson and Christian McCaffrey on the same team, use Perriman. There's really no point in starting Jarvis Landry in that game. Now if you think if you're the owner that owns Christian McCaffrey and Lamar Jackson on the same team, and you just basically want to make sure you get 10 points out of your receiver and you just don't want a 0, then you go with Jarvis Landry. But I tend to side with Jay on this, and I'm a risk taker, in a lot of these situations. So where I have Perriman, I'll probably have him in the lineup, this weekend. But I thought Landry was probably a good kind of line in the sand, and that's not a bad one. I mean, Landry's the number 15 PPR receiver on the season. Now, a tough, not a great matchup, against a team that has cornerbacks, forever. So let's move on and let's talk about another.
Well, first of all, I want to say to the listeners, that right there is why Dwain still has several teams kicking, and I'm sitting here on the sidelines. It's that high level, nuanced fantasy strategy that's lost on a guy like me who sits there watching film most of the day.
Whatever. Your Scott Fishbowl team made it much further than mine. I did not win my division, so.
Well, see, that's where the film comes in handy, because when you're drafting, 20 something rounds deep and it's only skill players, no kickers, no defenses, those late rounds are really where the money's made. And I think that, having watched a lot of these guys, it really paid off.
Yeah, it absolutely did for you. So, well, thanks, Jay, for being nice to your co-host. But let's talk about another misfit. And I know you posted some things on Twitter today about our buddy here, DeVante Parker, as well. Parker over the last 3 weeks, 35 PPR points, then 5, then 23. And in the week he had 5, he had a concussion. And I believe that was in the first quarter, may have been the second quarter. But he left that game early. He's got 59 catches for 954 yards, 8 touchdowns. Again, another guy that was drafted in the first round of 2015 out of Louisville. He was the 14th pick of the Dolphins. He's got 4 touchdowns over the last 3 weeks. The guy is, by far having his best season. And a guy that really, most people had written off. If you look at the way that he's being used, in this offense, unlike Perriman, who's just really being used more deep. He's kind of doing everything, Jay. And he's also by far, the most targeted guy, on the team. It's not like he's a 25% guy. He's at 18% on the season, but now he's definitely seeing those weeks where he had 26% of the targets in week 13. Week 14, we already talked about he got hurt, but then last week, 17%. But he's got 5 targets in the end zone over the last 3 weeks, 10 targets in the end zone on the season, which, leads the Dolphins. Preston Williams had been the leader in that until last week, and that guy's been out for how many weeks? So it tells you a little bit about Preston Williams. At average depth of targets, 14.6 yards. They line him up in the slot a little bit, but not a lot. They're asking him to win outside. Only 23% of his routes are coming from the slot this season. But this is the main guy right now in the Dolphins offense. You have a couple of people, in the backfield that nobody's heard of, and Patrick Laird and Myles Gaskin. You've got an underachieving tight end, Mike Gesicki. But you've lost Preston Williams, like we talked about. Jakeem Grant's gone for the season. So you've got Allen Hurns, Albert Wilson, and DeVante Parker. That's your receiving core right now for the Miami Dolphins. So Parker, another guy. And so what's funny, Jay, is in that league, one of the leagues I told you about where I'm going to be firing up Perriman. The guy that I'm playing against is going to be starting DeVante Parker. So these two guys are going to be going head to head. The 2015 wide receiver busts are actually going to have viability. So what's the film showing you on a guy like Parker? And, is this something that, even from a dynasty perspective, if we've got owners listening, not just thinking about championship weekend, because Parker, this has been an all season thing, Perryman, it's not going to make a big difference in dynasty. People know Godwin and Evans are the guys there, so you're not going to get a lot of value out of Perriman, but Parker's a guy you could think about moving right now. And so I would ask you to think of, kind of talk about that aspect too, Jay, if you're thinking long-term, what you would do with Parker based on what you're seeing.
Yeah, we decided to talk about DeVante Parker for this episode, and I had not really studied him this year, even though he's obviously someone interesting to look at given his newfound success. So I was all excited to pull him up on Game Pass, thinking I'd find a guy that had really improved, the technical aspects of his game. And I was very disappointed because he's the same old DeVante Parker. He's big, he's fast, he's strong. He's very good at the catch point, those jump balls, back shoulder fades. And that's who he's always been. But the route running, the efficiency of breaks, understanding leverage, all those finer details still are not there. The difference is Ryan Fitzpatrick is willing to throw those jump balls. He's willing to give his receiver a chance on contested catches. That's why Fitzpatrick has been boomer bust through his career. He's fourth in the NFL. The amazing stuff that Next Gen Stats is doing with data that's freely available. He's fourth in the NFL in aggressive percentage, which is the percentage of throws into tight coverage, less than 1 yard of separation when the ball arrives. So Ryan Fitzpatrick is fourth in the NFL in those types of throws. DeVante Parker has the 8th fewest yards per target of separation for all of his targets. So you have a quarterback that's willing to throw into coverage. You have a receiver who's good, at those types of receptions and is getting those targets, but he's not really getting the separation that will necessarily earn him consistent targets. When you talk about, from a dynasty standpoint, if you have a quarterback like Tom Brady or Drew Brees, the guys who are at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of aggressive percentage, these are quarterbacks who are throwing to the open guy. Parker may not have that consistency with earning those types of targets. And, when you get into breaking down his game, and just to get a little more specific on what I'm talking about, the as far as general, fine points of receiver play, I threw on this most recent game against the Giants, and, the Giants secondary is very poor. They got rid of Janoris Jenkins. They have DeAndre Baker, who's in the, bottom quartile of, all their corners basically are in the bottom quartile of graded corners according to Pro Football Focus. And Parker's getting open, but it's really on routes where he's giving away his breaks. He's leaning, with several steps before his break, he's leaning to the right or left, giving away which way he's going to go. And so he gets open, but you're like, this is not a process that's going to continue to get open. And then I go back and watch the Jets game, and, he's getting locked up on those same type of routes. And really, it's just that he's been able to succeed on, the physicality that he has. He's good at getting off press because he's physical. And then when the ball's in the air, he's done a great job going and getting it. But you worry long-term whether he'll earn those targets if the quarterback's not so willing to trust him to make those plays.
So in your, estimation, watching players that play like Parker, it is funny because there does seem to be some inconsistency, on a year-to-year basis. The other thing I did notice is that his catch rate is like a 59%, I believe. It's fairly low. And so when you're constantly having to battle for contested type balls, your catch rate's going to be lower. Also, the further down the field you're targeted, your catch rate, is going to go down as well. And that's more to do with quarterback accuracy, the further you go down the field. But when you look at a guy like Parker, can you really think of a comp that you can think of to him that kind of has what you're talking about? He's a good guy at beating press coverage, not the best route runner, but physical, good at the catch point. Can you think of, somebody in your mind that and maybe you can't, and that's okay, but is there someone that we could kind of give everybody a comp to, and there may be a couple, there may be one that turned out really bad, and maybe there's one that, turned out okay, for fantasy owners.
Yeah, I think when you really look at it, the guys, every year there's a contested catch specialist coming out in the NFL. And I think it's pretty rare for a guy who is a one-trick pony in that sense to really have success. Des Bryant is a guy who really made his money with physicality and being able to pull down those contested catches. But I think Des Bryant was a more refined route runner. Not the greatest route runner, but, better than what DeVante Parker shows. As far as, rookies like J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, who's a really physical player, really good at pulling down those jump balls. He can't even earn playing time or targets on an Eagles team that is really cycled through receivers. And, so you get into the issues of route running and reliability and earning your coach's trust, earning your quarterback's trust. And so I think that when you are a one-trick pony and that's really all you can do, you're just really at the mercy of who your coach is and who your quarterback is and whether they're willing to risk those types of throws to get you the ball.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff, because it is funny to me how certain guys like that. It's funny like how all of a sudden DeVante Parker, he's the example himself. Like you said, it's more about Fitzpatrick, and really they don't have anybody else at this point, so they got to go with it.
With Adam Gase, perfect example. He's a guy who came up with Peyton Manning. He earned his coaching acclaim, coaching Peyton Manning, who's an executioner. You know what I mean? He has his scheme. He's going to execute. He's going to hit the open guy. Reggie Wayne, talks about receivers getting chewed out for running the wrong routes. Demaryius Thomas, the famous story of him really getting chewed by Manning because he ran routes the wrong way and just spent hours upon hours practicing so he could be in position, and really made Demaryius Thomas the player he was. And so, you put a guy like DeVante Parker in that Peyton Manning influenced Adam Gase system where he's not running the routes the way they're supposed to be run. It's not a situation where he's going to get a lot of playing time or earn a lot of targets.
Well, and that's why Cody Latimer never could break the seal, with, the Broncos. He'd do fine. He'd show up in preseason after Peyton Manning was out of the game, make some big plays with a backup quarterback, and then he would never end up on the field. And, there are even people in Denver, that are part of the media that basically say that Peyton Manning just like he broke Cody Latimer. Like Latimer just basically, he couldn't do the things Peyton wanted, and it really just ruined his confidence. He's had a few games here and there with, the Giants, over the last couple of years. But it was the same kind of thing was really what you heard, was that he just wasn't in the right place at the right time. And so Manning didn't want him in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on Parker, there's another team that could be playing with a little bit of weather. So folks, we'll have to watch out, for that. But it's a Sunday game, so it looks pretty safe from rain. Not as great of a matchup. from a straight up receiver standpoint, it's not anything you're just going to shy away from. But they're playing the Bengals. But the Bengals, actually, one thing they do have a few of are cornerbacks. So Parker will have a little bit of a tougher matchup, but it definitely should be a competitive game. So for folks that are thinking about getting him in the lineup, you mentioned that he's fine against press. You talked about what his good things are, but if you're thinking about Parker, where would you rank him? Let's start with who we talked about already, Perriman.
Given the matchups, I would pick Perriman over Parker this week. Drake Kirkpatrick, William Jackson are pretty good man-to-man corners. So I think Parker could really struggle to separate on those underneath routes where he has been earning some targets this year, even though his depth of target typically is, more down the field. He'll probably still get those 50-50 balls, but when you're talking about a corner who is not, DeAndre Baker with his head in the clouds trying to learn how to play NFL football, the chances of having a better play on the ball from the corner are increased. So I don't think it's a really high upside matchup. And, there's a good chance that he's shut down. But, as far as the target volume, I think it'll be there because he's really, when you look at the Dolphins offense, he's the number one target.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on. We're not going to stay with the Dolphins, but we're going to talk about a former Dolphin as recently as this year. And that's Kenyan Drake. And Kenyan Drake is a guy that if you guys haven't seen Jay's Twitter feed early in this preseason at J Moyer FB, JMOYER FB on Twitter, he did quite a bit of work on Kenyan Drake along with his other favorite running back, Kalen Ballage. Jay apps. If you guys haven't seen how much Jay loves Kalen Ballage, definitely go check out his Twitter feed. Sorry, I'm trying to be funny. Jay's not.
Everybody turns off the podcast like, what? This guy loved Kalen.
No, Jay was trashed. Jay was really disappointed with Ballage before the season ever started and called out a lot of the things that ended up being his, that led to his demise before the injury even occurred. But in doing that, you talked really positively, about Kenyan Drake. You talked about, he had some issues, but you just didn't understand how there would be any way that Kenyan Drake would, cede carries to a guy like Kalen Ballage, at least from your point of view, you being a guy that's been a coach, before, and you know what you're looking for. Kenyan Drake's a guy you're excited about. And so if you look at, what Kenyan Drake did in Miami, he averaged 3.7 yards per carry. He only had 174 yards rushing on 47 attempts before, he was moved. But now he's with Arizona, 88 attempts for 426 yards. That's 4.8 yards per carry. And he's in an offense, that's allowing, some of his explosive ability that I'll let you talk about that, I don't want to steal that, you've talked about some of that before. But, on his breakaway attempts, so carries of 15 yards or more, 5.7%, which is, about 1%, above the league average. So Drake's been, consistent in that way. He's done a very nice job. He's got 5 attempts like that on those 88 attempts that we talked about. So he's really coming into his own, it seems like. And, last week, it paid off big, 23 attempts, Jay, for 146 yards and 4 touchdowns against the Browns, who were supposed to go get things right, against Arizona. But we don't have to talk about the Browns again. We've been there. But this is another, guy that, was a Dolphin, was a 3rd-round pick, 2016 out of Alabama. That's just, he looks really good. And honestly, David Johnson's almost nowhere to be seen. If you look at the way that the team is really handling things, David Johnson's utilization is like minimal. Now, I don't know if some of that, Jay, I don't know if there are just injuries that are lingering, with David Johnson, but his snaps, 24, 36, and 21% versus Kenyan Drake, 79, 66, and 75% over the last 3 weeks. Rushing attempts, Johnson, 19, 14, and 8%. Drake, 62, 50, and 64%. Inside the 5-yard line, it's all Drake. He's got 4 over the last 3 weeks. And even in the passing game where David Johnson has always been, pretty good. And this is something, where Drake is also good, which might've been part of the draw, to, Cliff Kingsbury, but routes per dropback, 60%, 39%, and 46%. And I mean, really, Chase Edmonds, like this last week, Chase Edmonds didn't even see the field. The week before, he saw a little bit of time in a game that the Cardinals lost, but this last weekend in their 14-point win, he didn't even get on the field. So Drake really seems to have just taken a hold of this backfield, and he's playing really well. And it was kind of a crescendo last weekend with that 4-touchdown performance. So what are you seeing? Is this something we think this guy can keep up? Is he somebody that we can trust in fantasy, moving forward? Any dynasty thoughts as well, because this is one where the Cardinals are going to have to figure this out.
Yeah, Dwain, I think that it really gets back to philosophy. Some of the same things that I was talking about with DeVante Parker and, ironically, the same coach, Adam Gase, at least up until this year in Miami. And you look at the best coaches in the NFL, Bill Belichick. He often takes castoffs from other teams who have washed out for one reason or the other, and he tells the guy, that Cordell Patterson didn't work out in New England, but there's a story when he talked to Bill Belichick, and Bill Belichick said, "We're going to let you be the player that you've always been meant to be." And what he means by that, and they talk about this all the time, there was that recent Nick Saban, Bill Belichick documentary on HBO, where Nick Saban is saying to Belichick, the one thing that you really taught me was to use players in ways that they feel comfortable. Use them, allow them to play to their strengths. Don't try to make them something they're not. Don't try to make them do everything. Let the guy do what he does well. And that philosophy is really, I think, important for success. And it's also important to understand as the fantasy player, which coaches are those types of coaches and which ones are not. Mm-hmm. And so Adam Gase is not that kind of coach. He has his system. He has his Peyton Manning system. He needs the right guy to do everything. Kenyan Drake can't pass block effectively. He's not going to see the field. I don't care if he's explosive in space. I don't care if he's a good pass catcher. I don't care if he has all these other spectacular strengths. He can't pass block, so he's not going to see the field. And so understanding the personnel and what players do well, understanding that scheme fit, and this is, something that I've been trying to work on both in just my analysis and also, for football, and then also in terms of applying it to fantasy, is really trying to get an idea of what coaches' philosophies are and how they're going to apply these players. And so Cliff Kingsbury, with his air raid background, one of the prime things that they value is skill in space, explosiveness in space, getting, carries in the run game, short passes. Can this guy make people miss and turn, a short play into a long one? And Kenyan Drake does that exceedingly well. His acceleration through change of direction is really up there at the top of the league. And you'll see this manifest as, defenders often taking what look like horrible angles on his runs. Matt Waldman pointed this out this past week, on a little quick pass where a linebacker seemed to have taken a terrible angle. And that's just something that Drake puts on film all the time. His vision is not necessarily the greatest. He's improved in his vision and also his footwork discipline. But, Adam Gase ran a high percentage of inside zone running plays, which are plays that really put a premium on a running back's vision, footwork. You want a guy like Frank Gore executing those runs. Whereas Drake is much better in a gap system where you tell him, okay, you need to go to the B gap, trust that the blocks are going to be there, time it up, and then explode through the hole. And the Cardinals, they run a lot of counter. They use a lot of deception in their run game, use Kyler Murray as a threat in, a heavily gap-oriented running game. And it's a perfect fit for Drake in that sense. And so when you have a coach that's willing to let a player do what he does well, and you have, a great fit in that sense, it's something that I think if Drake stays in Arizona and continues, to do what he's doing, there's no reason that this productivity would drop off, because it's just such a great fit. And he really is elite in those areas that he's asked to do.
Yeah, the team, David Johnson, he's still got 2 more years left on this deal, so next year, base salary of $10 million. the year after is $8 million, and he's got a $3 million signing bonus, a $1 million roster bonus, both of those years. So his cap hit is 14 and then 12 million. It doesn't look like there are a lot of clauses as far as them being able to get out of that. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do. I mean, they gave up a third round draft pick, I believe, to get Kenyan Drake from the Dolphins. I feel like that's what it was. It may have been I may be wrong. That might've been a 4th round pick, but they're going to have to figure out, how they're going to handle this, because to pay David Johnson that much to just handle 10 or 15% of your workload each week, like that seems like a misuse of cap space. But we're also in a time where I don't see another team wanting to come make a trade for David Johnson's contract. We just saw what that was like with Melvin Gordon.
Yeah, I think it's tough for them to move on from the contract this offseason. And, you may have mentioned this. I'm not sure. Drake is a free agent after this year, unrestricted free agent.
Yeah.
So, there's the possibility that he does move on. But you would think a guy who's been through sort of hell in terms of, his team being willing to use him how he's best used would be really attracted to staying in a place like Arizona where the coach, really appreciates what he does well and lets him do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you. And as far as, fantasy owners go for, this coming weekend, I mean, if you own Drake, I mean, it's just a situation, in my opinion, where, I mean, obviously there's I don't know how many teams that made the playoffs actually have, a guy like Kenyan Drake. You had to wait a bit to get, his services, but they're playing against Seattle, which is basically a neutral, matchup against the run, from a fantasy perspective. But this isn't the Seattle defense, that we used to think of. Is nothing like that, anymore. And when you think about, the numbers that I talked about earlier, as far as utilization, I mean, this is not, I think for whatever reason, some people still think, like when I interact with people on Twitter, people still almost, for whatever reason, I think maybe it's for namesake or whatever, but they feel like David Johnson is like getting half the work. He's not. He's getting hardly anything. Just.
Yeah, man, the talent is there with Drake. The volume is there. It's a good offense. They have some down weeks, but, it's an offense that's been improving.
Yeah, it's an offense that runs a lot of plays, when it can. Plays per minute, number one. In the league, plays per game's lower because sometimes they fail to control time of possession based on turnovers or their defense just not being able to get a stop, right, and get the other team off the field.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're,
but I mean, I think I know where you were heading with this. It's hard to take him out of your starting lineup at this point based on what I've seen and based on everything that you said.
39 fantasy points last week in a PPR setup. I mean, he did have 4 touchdowns, but he's just the kind of guy that with the volume he's getting now, I think we've seen his floor. It's around a 10, 10 points, but now you've seen what his ceiling is, so I think he could easily against Seattle put up 20, 22, 23 fantasy points, this weekend because, he's a plus in the passing game as well. So,
yeah. So who's a guy that who would you put as someone that similar type of player that you're debating on whether to start
like
Drake
DeVante
or
Freeman would be, in that category. Like I'm starting him over David Montgomery. I would start him over Kareem Hunt. Obviously I would stick with Nick Chubb if I had Nick Chubb. So, I mean, those are, let me scroll down through this list and just see if I can think of any other, examples, obviously any of the Chiefs backs, but like, I would say he's in the same conversation as Marlon Mack, but I would probably lean to him right now over Marlon Mack. I think he's right there on the, I think he's in the RB2, conversation, if I'm looking for a guy like Le'Veon Bell, I'm going to start Kenyan Drake over Le'Veon Bell at this point. DeAndre Washington, I don't know, because Josh Jacobs is out this weekend. I definitely like Drake as the player better than DeAndre Washington, but Washington has got a pretty good matchup against Green Bay. That'd be a tougher one for me. What would you do in that situation?
I mean, I think I'm going Drake with how the Raiders offense has struggled. The Chargers defense is not necessarily shutting anybody down, but no. I think I would go Drake. I don't, like you said, Seattle's defense isn't the Seattle we're used to. So I think it's a pretty good matchup for him. The opportunity's there. And like I said, the talent fits really well with what they're asking him to do.
Yeah, I see those guys. I see their medians being similar, but I do think that Drake probably carries a bigger upside. So
Yeah, well,
that's some of those guys would be.
the 4 touchdown, 122-yard ceiling is it's a pretty good. That's a
Yeah,
pretty good ceiling,
yeah. The thing I like, with a guy like Washington, is just him being the main guy. Carrying the ball, he'll get a few more receptions than what Drake probably will, but the upside as far as the touchdowns go, I think that Drake just carries more upside there. So we've got another former Dolphin. We didn't intend this. I'm just now thinking through this and thinking, wow, we've got three guys we've got one that's still with the Dolphins, one that was traded from the Dolphins this year, and then one that left via free agency. And now we're going to talk about a quarterback, and that's Ryan Tannehill.
Yeah, all these guys, guys who washed out of Miami and are lighting up the league in other locations.
It's crazy, right?
Adam Gase is the one constant.
Seriously. See, what would happen to these Jets if they could leave?
Why did DeVante Parker, Kenyan Drake, and Ryan Tannehill all suck before?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Tannehill, and you look at his touchdowns per attempt, he was never, terrible in this. He was never great, but his best year ever was a 6.2%. This year he's at a 7.1% completion percentage. Jay, 72%. His previous high had been a 67%. If you look at from a fantasy perspective, his fantasy points per dropback, 0.69. That's second in the NFL to Lamar Jackson, who's having a nut season, which is 0.91, which is like off the charts historically.
Yeah, the 1,000+ rushing yards helps that points per dropback.
Absolutely. But Tannehill is second. He ranks second in the league right now. I mean, the guy has got some chemistry for sure with A.J. Brown. Those two guys, I mean, they had another great throw and catch from deep in their own zone this last weekend where Tannehill put, nice touch on the ball. A.J. Brown, it was about a 40-yard gain. But those two guys, they've really synced up. I mean, I don't know. This is, Tannehill's a guy that for me, he never made me super excited, but he was a guy that I always felt like, he's got something. He's not a zero. I never thought he was going to be a Peyton Manning or anything. But I always felt like, injuries or one thing or another just kind of got in the way. And then he kind of ruffled some feathers with some teammates, a couple of times where, he lost the team or whatever. But right now in Tennessee, the guy's playing great. If you're in the fantasy, playoffs, and I have a team that's playing for major this weekend. So I'll be looking, for your thoughts here, Jay. But I've got to choose between Ryan Tannehill, who's playing against the Saints, and Dak Prescott. On the matchup alone, I'm going Prescott, but now Prescott's got this AC joint thing that has me a little bit concerned. But if you look at Tannehill, over the last several weeks, here are his fantasy points: 19, 34, 16, 29, 25. I mean, the guy's, he's been great down the stretch, honestly, down the stretch. He's been as good as anybody but Lamar Jackson over these last several games. So I want to get your take on what you're seeing with Tannehill. Are there differences that you're seeing from what you saw with Miami, or is it more of the same? And he's, it's kind of back to this coaching thing. He's actually in a scheme with the right kind of talent around him, and he's the right fit for what they want to do. Because I tell you what, since he's came in to take this thing over, they're a different team versus when they had Mariota under quarterback.
Yeah, so when I watch Ryan Tannehill in Tennessee, as opposed to Miami, I don't think that he has transformed himself necessarily as a player. One of the things that Tennessee does extremely well, top 5 probably in the league in terms of, is pass blocking. You watch him and really has a lot of time to go through his progressions. And, he's always been a guy who doesn't necessarily process extremely quickly. It's not that he is, terrible at going through his progressions. It's just that he's probably middle of the pack in terms of NFL quarterback. with people who do this extremely well, the Tom Brady's, Drew Breeses. But he's had really, really outstanding protection the last several weeks. When he's been really on fire against some defenses that aren't necessarily, you look at the last 4 games they played, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, Oakland, and Houston, those are 4 defenses who have really struggled, in general, and also to stop, the passing game. So in Miami, he wasn't getting that kind of time. A.J. Brown has been a revelation. He is extremely strong. He's very big. In college, he wasn't necessarily explosive, but he's added an explosive element to his game that I just didn't see on film, back at Ole Miss. And so he's really been, overpowering corners. You can't really jam him. He's just, physically superior to these guys. He's always been excellent with his route breaks. And now when he has the explosion to separate after he gets his release, he's hitting that 60-yard bomb, from inside their own 10-yard line on the first pass play of the game this past week. So he's a guy that's getting targets and executing on those targets. As far as Tannehill's, skill set, already talked about his processing. He is an athletic quarterback, doesn't necessarily have refined pocket skill. You'll see him sort of step up into rushers when he doesn't necessarily need to. His accuracy is sort of hit or miss, not necessarily pinpoint, more of an area thrower. Does have good arm strength. And then with the pass blocking in Tennessee's scheme, where they have a lot of, downfield, deep in-breaking routes, which again are perfect with A.J. Brown's skill set. It's a really good scheme, talent fit. And I think that as far as, as long as their offensive line is able to protect him how they have, then Tannehill will continue to produce. The thing I question about this week, though, is New Orleans' defense, this year has been pretty good. They're good at rushing the passer. Cam Jordan is one of the best in the NFL.
A.J. Brown will likely see Lattimore all game.
Exactly. It's a tough matchup for him. I think Tannehill could struggle because this is, one of the first real big tests he's had as quarterback of the Titans, at least.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he's been pushing the ball further down the field, and I think part of that is due to what you're talking about, that time in the pocket. Over the last several games, that was one of the things earlier in his career, more underneath type passing. And it does seem to be hitting bigger plays down the field. Percentage of deep passes this year is right around 13%, which matches a career high. But yeah, I agree with you that, the New Orleans game is intriguing from one perspective. I know that Tennessee needs to keep playing, to stay in the race. And it could be, the type of game where, the Saints are going to put up their points. So you could really see a good back and forth game, but it could also be a game where Tennessee is just defensively overmatched, because if Lattimore does take away A.J. Brown, then all of a sudden you're not as excited really about what Tannehill has to work with. I mean, Corey Davis is a guy that, at some point, I guess we need to talk about, because he just, he's just disappeared, this season. Delaney Walker's hurt. So you've got Jonnu Smith. I mean, really what they want to do is playing games where they can keep it close and keep Derrick Henry as a major component, right, of their game plan. And then that's also helping to set up Tannehill and some of the bigger plays. If they can do that, they might be able to, manage, the game. But I think I agree with you. If Dak's healthy, and he's gonna play, I think just the matchup against the Eagles secondary is just too much for me to pass up. My one concern would be with Dak getting knocked out of the game, but he's a pretty tough guy. He's not the type of guy that, will let any kind of little injury, knock him out. It'd have to be pretty serious for Prescott, to allow himself to leave the game. So yeah, I'll probably will stick with Dak, but for folks that are leaning on Tannehill, if you don't have, a guy like Lamar Jackson, and you say you waited on quarterback in your draft, it's crazy, really, Jay. When you look at the quarterbacks this season, Lamar Jackson, you could have got after the 10th round. Deshaun Watson, you did have to draft typically as one of the top, 3 quarterbacks. But then Dak Prescott wasn't being drafted quite often. Jameis Winston was a 12th to 13th round pick. Russell Wilson, nobody wanted Russell Wilson this year. I mean, that's your top 5. And then Josh Allen's number 6, Kyler Murray's number 7. None of those quarterbacks besides Deshaun Watson did you have to take before round 10. So this was definitely a year where waiting on quarterback, paid off. And then if you look at some of the guys people were taking early, Aaron Rodgers, that hasn't been worth it at all. Baker Mayfield was sometimes the second or third quarterback taken, in fantasy drafts. And would you want to own Baker Mayfield right now? Well, if you do, you're probably not in the fantasy playoffs. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Well, the one common thread between all those guys that you mentioned up there, the top 6 or 7 quarterbacks, is the ability to extend plays with their legs, buy time in the pocket, break the pocket, pick up rushing yards, especially in Lamar Jackson's case, obviously. And, I think with, you and I talked about this recently. I think with some of the changes in the NFL in terms of practice regulations, it's less about execution of, extremely complicated schemes. You still get that with, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, guys that came up, in the old NFL where you could practice year round with your coaches and, really rep things out hundreds and thousands of times. But now I think it's just tough to reach that level of execution. And so having a quarterback who can create on his own and capitalize on gaps in the defensive execution really, we'll see. Trends like this, everyone's always said, oh, this is the next big thing in the NFL. And then, you actually had mentioned this when we talked. You've had your Colin Kaepernicks, your RG3s, where defenses catch up. But, I struggle to think of it.
People do forget, like, how sensational Robert Griffin III was before his injury. It was Lamar Jackson-like. And then, to your point, Kaepernick went to a Super Bowl. I mean, didn't quite have what Lamar Jackson does, but I mean, I remember the game. Don't you remember the game against the Packers in the playoffs where I think Kaepernick ran for like over 100 yards in that game. If I'm remembering that correctly. So, I mean, this is something that,
well, he was anointed by several people as the greatest quarterback of all time. And that, that he was going to be
defenses adjusted. It's also interesting, really, if you look at this, and you think about the teams that are doing really good, this year, not every single one of them, Jay, but, a lot of them, they have a really good running game.
Yeah. I mean, back to, how big a proponent I am of the running game, not necessarily popular in analysis these days to really harp on, a detailed and effective and, somewhat complicated running game. But like you said, a lot of the teams that have had success have built their team's offense around the running game, Baltimore or San Francisco. But back to my original point about the quarterbacks is, you've had those individual performances that we talked about, like Kaepernick, RG3. I can't remember a time. I don't think there's been a time where the top 5, 6, 7 guys are all those types of quarterbacks who are, very athletic, have a rushing component, but then also, more importantly, are able to buy time, navigate the pocket, escape the pocket, throw on the run. And I think a lot of it gets back to, a system that harps less on execution of these expansive schemes and more on just the talent of players executing schemes that are a little bit simpler.
Right. Yeah. And I think honestly, that's something that, maybe, I know you and I, we talked about, how do we want to handle, this podcast for the off season? And, we want to definitely have some. We won't be doing them, quite as often as we're doing right now. But I think that's definitely one of the topics that we should, talk about maybe sometime after the Super Bowl, as we start to head into the offseason, just looking at what's working in the NFL, what are some of the trends, and maybe that's where we start. Really is, with what we're seeing with the quarterbacks. And you made a lot of great points off air, that were in addition to the comments that you just made that I thought were pretty fascinating. And I think there's a lot we could do with that. So I think that's something that, we'll have to talk about moving forward. So before we hop off, Jay, any other names that you want to mention? For these folks, fantasy championship weekend, did we miss any misfits? I'm sure there's some, but if there's anybody that's just kind of, you're like, man, I got to say something, about this player. I mean, in addition to Perriman, Parker, Drake, and Tannehill, who all we've hit, our island of misfit toys. Anybody else?
Well, one interesting situation is, a misfit rookie quarterback, Will Grier, getting his first start in Carolina. We've talked a lot on this podcast about DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, Kyle Allen. Greer's a little bit more of an accurate downfield passer, a guy who plays with a lot of anticipation. Struggled in the preseason because, when you're that anticipatory passer, if you're not on the same page as your receivers and you're not quite sure what you're seeing from the defense, anticipation can be a bad thing. So I'll be really interested to see, one, whether Grier shows anything promising. Two, if the target distribution and, successful target distribution changes at all between Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore. Because Samuel was getting some downfield targets, but they just weren't converting. A lot of inaccurate downfield passes from Kyle Allen, also to DJ Moore. And so I'm interested to see if Moore will get as much of that production that he had with Kyle Allen, running a lot of slants, the most prominently targeted receiver in the NFL on slant routes. Big week for a lot of DJ Moore owners who do happen to be in title games because, DJ Moore has provided great value on his ADP this year.
Yeah, absolutely. He's been great down the stretch. Well, one name I want to bring up, and you may not have had time to watch this guy again. I didn't mention anything to you, but if we're just looking at the last, 3 games, your top 3 fantasy running backs over that period are Christian McCaffrey, Ezekiel Elliott, and none other than Miles Sanders. Anything new on Miles Sanders? Any thoughts there? Anything that you've seen watching him, whether in film study or just in passing in your time? As maybe on a Sunday afternoon, you had a little time to sit down and watch some football, and maybe Miles Sanders was on.
Yeah, I've also spent a lot of time talking about Miles Sanders, and I think a few things that have stood out to me lately. One, he's gotten a lot better once he's in the open field of, understanding his blockers' leverage and creating opportunities in the open field to pick up extra yardage. And you've seen him have some explosive plays doing that, which is great because he has that explosive ability, that athletic ability to do that. Early in the season, even in the open field, he was really struggling to find running lanes. There was that one play that, posted still shots where, there's a 10-yard hole in the middle of the field and he sort of stutters, slips, falls down, gets a 4-yard gain on a play that, should have realistically gone for a minimum 10, 15 yards. So that is a big improvement. Another thing that he has done extremely well is developing as a downfield receiver. He had a remarkable touchdown catch this past week, really an amazing play by Carson Wentz to hit him in the back corner of the end zone on an improvisational play. Sanders has really excelled running downfield routes, and they're targeting him on those downfield routes. Bill Belichick was talking about that's one of the main things they were trying to take away when they faced them recently was Sanders getting out down the field.
And that says a lot. That says a lot,
of,
because Belichick wants to take away the 1 or 2 things he thinks that are your best things.
Yeah. And so, that is a talent that's going to bode well for Sanders throughout his career, the fact that he can bring that receiving threat to the table. Now, between the tackles, he's still struggling with his processing, not necessarily disciplined with his footwork, jump cuts that aren't really there or necessary. But the Eagles have tailored his runs to a lot of gap-style runs, and their offensive line is really an excellent offensive line, especially when you get into talking about run blocking. So you have a guy who's explosive. He's added a receiving element to his game. He's improved his open field vision, footwork, decision-making, running behind an offensive line that's probably a top 5 run-blocking unit. And, that's a recipe for really great production, especially in a PPR format.
Yeah. Yeah, man. He's I did draft him some. So on any of the teams where I'm alive that I have him, I've definitely been riding the Miles Sanders wave, even though he may still have some cringeworthy moments of the way he's handling his, jump cuts when he doesn't need them. but from a fantasy perspective right now. So that's good to hear, though. I mean, it sounds like, his game is improving. He was a guy that was backing up Saquon Barkley, for the most part until that final year. So, maybe he's growing into, who he's going, to be still, as a runner. That's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, and that's another thing, Dwain, that I'm studying, that I've noticed, anecdotally, since the CBA changed, is run block coordination. Getting all your linemen on the same page. There's a lot of communication, a lot of technical footwork. It's not easy to do that, and when the practice time is condensed, you see these teams that really struggle to put together their run blocking in the beginning of the season, and then gradually iron it out. You look at the Bengals; they couldn't run the ball for 3/4 of the season. Now Joe Mixon's going for 100 yards a game, and so it just takes a little more time to get on the same page. So earlier in the season, the Eagles' O-line, as talented as they were, they showed flashes, but it wasn't quite as consistent. Now that they've had time to really get in a groove, the offensive blocking is just much more consistent. And so, I'm wondering if that's a trend that will hold up in terms of these running backs who aren't necessarily as skilled or as disciplined, struggling early in the season. And then as the run blocking improves in front of them, Mixon is another guy who's not necessarily the most disciplined runner. As the run blocking improves in front of them, they're able to use really the hallmarks of their game, which is that explosive athletic ability. So these types of guys could be really good early season buy low candidates after, week 2, 3, 4, when their offensive lines haven't quite gelled yet.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually seen quite a few guys, pick up steam, over the stretch run. Derrick Henry, is another one that we've seen that with. So yeah, I think that's
another guy who vision and footwork efficiency isn't necessarily his calling card. He's an athletic guy, very fast, breaks tackles, but not necessarily a very disciplined runner. So I do think that there's something to look at here in terms of running back archetypes, buy low candidates, guys that you would expect to improve as the year goes on.
Right. Yeah. No, that's more good stuff. Well, we've been here for an hour, so we're about to hop. Any last words of advice or anything else, Jay, or have we hit it all?
No, man, I just want to thank the listeners. I mean, it's been, wrapping up the fantasy season. It's been really fun getting to talk with you every other week. I hope that people have enjoyed the show. Like you said, we'll look to continue at least in some form over the off season and hopefully do something similar next year.
Yeah, absolutely.
And good luck in those championship battles.
Yeah, man. Thank you. And I'm with you. I'm so appreciative of the listeners. We've got good engagement from this audience. Folks always asking us, when's the next pod going to come out? And you don't know how much Jay and I, appreciate that. Obviously we love just doing this just to do it, but it doesn't make it's that much better when we know it's something that you guys enjoy listening to and that you actually find value from. I've seen so many comments on Twitter, where someone will come in and there's a conversation going, and I've seen people come in and be like, hey, you should go listen to this episode, with Dwain and J. They break this down, and that's pretty cool. So we're very appreciative. We enjoy doing it. And we'll definitely talk about, how we can bring some things to you this off season. And if you guys want to drop anything, in our mentions on Twitter, you have any ideas, we're happy to hear them. And as always, we got to thank, Matt Waldman. We appreciate him giving us the platform to do this on, just getting to talk some football, but getting to do it, through something such as the RSP. Obviously, that's a great honor to both Jay and I. So for you guys that are still in your championship rounds, good luck this weekend. Unless you're playing one of us, which I don't know if there are any of those. I don't know if we have any buddies listening or not, Jay. I know I have one. And Perry, you're going down. See you guys next time.